Hi there. Welcome to the third day of this online edition of Transformation Digital Art. Thank you for watching. Thank you for participating. I feel really privileged and proud that so many practices are opened up and shared at this symposium. It's really a pleasure. And this is exactly what LIMA is aiming for, bridging the gaps between theory and practices, gaining and transferring the knowledge, and connecting and supporting artists and institutions in sustaining digital artworks for future generations. This symposium shows the importance of a collaborative approach. What we need is to strengthen and sustain this network of care and to envision and create a lasting infrastructure for the preservation of our software-based artworks. That's what LIMA stands for. My name is Gaby Wijers and I'm director of LIMA. And exactly 2 years ago, today, 2 years ago, Gabriele Gennacci, initiator of the research project documenting digital art, presented the project for the first time in the Netherlands at the NACA MAG conference in Maastricht. Today's symposium is in the scope of this project. I hope you like it. Thank you and enjoy today's session. I'm happy to hand over to today's moderator, Shiloh Phillips. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaby. All right. So in preparation for today, after these first 2 days of the conference with Gaby, we talked about what's left on the table around the issue of documentation. So on the one hand, one of the things that we'd like to explore today are the platforms and the networks of care. And the other dimension that we'd like to dig deeper into are the documentation of pioneers, specifically pioneers in the field of media arts. I'm very happy today to have a brilliant lineup of speakers for you for this closing session. And a few words about myself before we dive into the discussions. Shiloh Phillips, artist, educator, and researcher based in Amsterdam at the moment. And for this session, we'll be starting off with Katrina Sluis, who's hailing in, I heard it was very late at night there, from Canberra in Australia. She'll be sharing her work with us on the preservation of photo documentation on social media. She's currently the Associate Professor and Head of Photography and Media Arts at the Australian National University in Canberra. So we're very happy to have her here with us for the first presentation. Second up will be Stefan Gubatsky, the importance of digital distribution. And he's a researcher and artist working in the fields of media art and theory, graduate of the Art School of Chicago. So these two presentations will set the stage for today's discussion, which will run for half an hour, and then I will introduce the second half with Annie Abrahams and Helen Varley-Jamieson. But first, I pass the floor to Katrina.
Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, good evening, everyone. My name's Katrina, and I'm actually a co-investigator on the project Documenting Digital Art, the 3-year funded research project that Gaby just mentioned. And she invited me to speak about the strand of the project I'm involved in, which is hosted at the Photographers Gallery in London, where I'm adjunct research curator. And this strand focuses on documentation as an expanded practice that is radically changing the ways in which we look at, participate, and generate art, with a specific focus on the cultural value of documentation in an age of photographic hyperproduction. And this is quite crucial to add to this kind of debate because, as Michelle Henning has suggested, photography has been crucial in mediating both the art object and the museum itself. and is a ubiquitous tool of personal and social documentation outside the museum, thanks to the fusion of camera and phone. And photography is a very interesting kind of non-medium or non-medium to view the art object through, because photography is both a technology of reproduction as well as the carrier of artworks and subject of art, and a tool of self-expression all at once. And I think it seems only fitting that if we are to understand documentation of digital art, that we also begin to unpack the cultural dynamics of computational reproduction and the shifting role of technologies of capture and in all its expanded forms, from the art selfie to the screenshot. And in this sense, we are keen to position photography not just as a transparent tool for producing documentation both inside and outside the museum by audiences and professionals, but as a medium that has undergone its own digital transformation. The photograph is now network, screen-based and fleeting. It's a software output, a product of algorithms, processual and performative. And in this strand of the research, we're keen to reflect on this, drawing on the literature of photography and post-critical museology. And I also think it's interesting to consider that photography, like digital art, has had to fight to find its place inside the museum, and European photo institutions are now hiring digital curators and also trying to work out how they can engage with the vernacular born digital, processual, ubiquitous photographic image in all its slipperiness, and also how it's to be collected and understood. And on that, with that in mind, last month, Annette Decker and I invited curators, artists, theorists, and technologists to address how, from the Google Art project to the screenshot, from the JPEG to the gigapixel image, photographic technologies continue to mediate our experience of art and culture. And at a time where art selfies mix with installation shots on Instagram, how are practices of audience documentation changing the status and meaning of art? How can institutions engage with this expanded field of documentation? And what are the implications for art history and cultural memory? And how is the pandemic changing the cultural value of documentation? How do contemporary practices of photographic reproduction intersect with critical discourses of authorship, ethics, and control in new media platforms? And so this resulted in a series of 3 events with 6 speakers, which had a combined audience of around 300 people who attended from both hemispheres. And I'm going to sort of discuss briefly who we invited and what those findings were from that strand of the research and those events. And we kicked off with and Without All's Photographic Reproduction in the Art Museum, which was named after a fantastic essay by Professor Michelle Henning of University of Liverpool, who really set the stage for the question of the history and politics of reproduction in the Art Museum. And with Ben St. John of Google Arts, of the Google Art camera team, it gave us a glimpse of how this presently plays out in dominant platforms. And I wanted to draw your attention to a part of this essay where she focuses on what is called the Facsimile Debates, in which during the period of 1929 to 1930, there was an anxiety that was aired about the difference between the original and its reproduction. And one theorist, Dorner, suggested that reproduction, like the museum, democratizes the experience of art. And the museum already sort of impedes the art object by pulling it out of places and placing it into the institution, where others such as Eberlein said that reproduction destroys the aura of art and damages the experience of the original, and that the more faithful the reproduction, the more dangerous. And that these are forgeries or dangerous supplements. And as we all know, Benjamin came in and suggested that reproduction enhances access to art, but in the process destroys aura. In producing new forms of attention, it does not leave the artwork untouched. the destruction of aura is necessary in new kinds of attention. And this also links back to the kind of anxieties of the audience using their camera in the institution. So Google, of course, is desperately trying to realize the dream of a kind of democratic institution, digitizing everything. And they have been very much involved in hoovering up institutions at scale. And I think what's interesting about this is, whilst there is a very technical and logistical pipeline of digitization and documentation of the art object, usually analog, what it produces online with all this technology is an analog model of cultural value in which the space and geography of the institution is reproduced by photographic technologies. And of course, Google is at pains to separate Google image search from the Google Art project. But as we probably all know, where we tend to turn when we're looking for documentation, and I can tell you now that this is my students' preferred site for retrospectives of artists. So there is a kind of process of purification happening here online between different kinds of digitization and why and how it demarcates different kinds of documentation. And here we have the Night Watch in the Google Art Project interface as it currently stands. In our second event, we looked at actually the politics of collecting Instagram, and Natalie Kane spoke of the impossibility of them to collect Instagram. But this question of where and what to be documented and preserved reared its ugly head. There is the question of authenticity, image and interface, and Natalie suggested that they had decided what would they collect of Instagram. First, they were interested in collecting the first filters that appeared by Cole Rise, reflecting the studio in the pocket. But she suggested that the filters, of course, are essentially algorithms and you can't separate them from the platform meaningfully. And so there goes into a kind of crisis about, you know, what do they collect? And ultimately, they are concerned that they'll never get their hands on the source code and that Instagram would not allow it due to all sorts of IP issues. But they also wouldn't actually, let's express that they wouldn't collect the photos in the digital design department, and that would be let to the photography team. So again, there is this kind of separation and purification happening in the space of what gets documented, what gets preserved, and how the photographic image or these technologies are understood by the institution. And the same thing happened when Annie Wolliner spoke about collecting social photography, in which whilst there was a real interest in a more inclusive collecting and liaising with the public, ultimately collecting in this sense meant working with the public to create a very limited selection of a feed of images, which then get displaced from the interface. So you see the opposite problem happening here. In our final event, we looked at the question of documenting ruins and the ruins of the web through the work of two artists, Olli Lialina and Ofri Kanani. And this was a really interesting conclusion to the series, where the question of how expanded notions of documentation, audience documentation, and the fragmentation of this might work. And so Ofri, her presentation focused on the fire that destroyed a significant portion of the 20 million objects of the National Museum of Brazil in 2018, prompting us to think about what happens when a museum that doesn't have a virtual collection loses its physical collection, and how and which cultural materials and histories are retained. And she described this as a kind of lobotomy of Brazilian memory, and that it seems almost unimaginable that so many items were wiped off the earth, and what survived was a few digitized collections and a handful of 3D renderings. And she now works with what has been scraped after the kind of destruction of this museum by various initiatives such as university students working with Wikimedia to get a public call out of what photographs remained of the museum and its collection. And we're seeing some of the examples she showed here in the collection. And she sees this as a kind of way in which there might be an alternative, more fragmentary and more alive, user-based, bottom-up generated collection as a form of digital recollection. She also notes that there is, weirdly, the ghost of the museum still being animated by the Google Art project. And in her practice, she is working with former workers of the institution in order to take her on tours and discuss parts of the institution. So she's interested through her practice, how could she begin to work with these digital leftovers of the kind of 3D scans of the meteor that we see in the bottom right-hand corner? How can she work to animate this? And how these new species of spaces emerge in a kind of techno-political environment where vertical institution hierarchies and horizontal networks entangle into a new political mesh. And we concluded with a project that Annette spoke about the other day. Olia spoke about her work with GeoCities Archive. And I think it's really clear for her that she is not interested in kind of questions of authenticity and reproduction, but keeping memory alive in the kind of project. Hang on, Siri's just woken up, speaking to me. So how do we keep these things in circulation? We don't have a task to preserve, but to circulate. So how can we use network culture to keep this documentation alive and engage with by new generations and new audiences? And of course, Olia points out the web has constantly been in a process of death. It's built into its DNA and also its kind of platforms. And she sort of concluded that she engages in speculative restoration as a practice, where the importance is animating an imaginary past. And she concluded with these wonderful guidelines for her work, which is about ensuring that it can be recirculated, rejecting the kind of politics of big data, rejecting the digital humanities, as she said, and it being stupid, it being usable, it being weak and able to be recirculated, and how this is a kind of paradigm that sits in opposition to many of the ways we think about documentation. So just to conclude, these projects that I've sort of covered sort of talks about how documentation scatters across and beyond the museum, and how can it be used and shaped? How can we understand this field of documentation? Where does it begin and end? And its multiplicity. Ultimately, we would say there is a tension between the institutional context where documentation is to be managed, strategized, controlled. There is never enough. But at the same time, in the wider field of documentation, it's abundant, playful, audience-centered, circulating in very different kind of contexts and new meanings kept alive. And that, with that sort of idea, I'd love to conclude.
Thank you so much, Katrina. That was wonderful. What a rich presentation, and also really interesting to unpack the default assumptions around the neutrality of photography in documentation as well. I think that's really, I would like to ask one small question, which is a question you posed yourself, which is about how the pandemic has affected documentation. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it really has highlighted how documentation operates in different ways across the institution. And it's not a very joined up way, even as the digital also is modeled across institutions. So you have one version of the digital the digital, in marketing another, in audience development, education and curation. And I think what we see here is the kind of way in which there has been a kind of crisis at a very scrabbling to make sense across marketing, the marketing teams suddenly become in ascension, whilst education teams are being fired during the pandemic. And how kind of the need to be, remember me, remember the institution. I know it's really tough, but another newsletter, oh, have you seen our latest project? And there is a kind of sense that the marketing and the need to remind the audience that you're still there and we still have great stuff has been the kind of dominant way I've seen mainstream institutions operate. And of course, there are exceptions with great projects, but yeah, I think you really see that kind of sense of, are we presenting ourselves, as a marketing voice or as a kind of cultural voice where we're reanimating archives?
Good critical questions. Thank you so much. One brief comment before we switch to Stefan. There is a link shared in the YouTube channel for a shared Etherpad. If you have not yet done so and you're listening in and would like to ask questions or post comments or take notes, we would love it if you would contribute to this pad. You don't have to log in, you can just type. Everyone can type along. This is a collaborative documentation experiment. So please feel free to write. Everyone has their own color, so it will become a very colorful rainbow. All right, thank you very much. Katrina, I would like to pass straight on to Stefan. Go ahead.
All right, thank you so much. Let me just try to share my screen, and I hope that this goes without any hiccups. And there we go. Hi, so my name is Stephan Gubatsky. I'm a researcher and artist, and for the past year or so, I've been working with LIMA on a research project through which we try to chart the established and emergent economies forming around software-based art practices. So first in 2 or 3, it's okay. First, in 2 or 3 sentences, I will share the scope of the research and the areas that it explored, and then jump into one particular aspect of it that bears relevance in the context of this conference, I think, namely the fragility of the artwork itself in a digital art economy forming around distributed ledger technologies or blockchains. And I know that we all might be quite saturated with the topic of NFTs and crypto art, but I hope that the angle that I'm coming at it from will provide some useful information that's not necessarily all redundant, as I believe that this particular perspective remains somewhat underexposed in this larger discussion. So the larger research that my presentation is anchored in was trying to answer a set of loosely defined questions, such as what are the challenges and opportunities that media specificity of software-based artworks pose for the art world's established models, such as the limited edition model or the rental model of our distributors. And then what are some of the formatting strategies that can be employed to ease their integration into these models? Or conversely, how are the models themselves changing in answer to these characteristics? So we looked at, for example, the festival circuit and its condition and the developments within it, such as the vertical integration of its strongest nodes and the development of collaborative frameworks that form between organizations, then the experiments within the gallery system, and of course, the attempts at establishing an economical space for digital art in an online context. Things like the ambition of spotification of digital art, an ambition to economically activate the audience, the different attempts at developing a platform economy that follows the models provided by adjacent media industries, such as music publishing, television, and so on, and the way in which those borrowed models are hybridized with the conventions of the art market. And also the entrance of art into alternative channels of distribution and their inherent monetization mechanisms, things like app stores or HIO. And also more general tendencies such as the reconfigured relation between ownership and accessibility and new ways in which those notions are themselves being understood, for example, in the context of the NFT space. And further, the disintermediation sentiment of the narratives of blockchain-based developments, and then conversely, a new type of intermediaries that emerge and replace or enter into some sort of combination with the legacy gatekeepers, as is the dominant term to refer to the middlemen in those discussions. Now, this is more or less, especially this last part, the backdrop of the topic I will narrow into now. And as a segue into the proper subject of my presentation, I will now read a short poem by Ian Holmes, a professor of bioengineering at Berkeley. He writes, "I have digitized your plums and sold them, although strictly speaking, I sold the hash of a URL to a JSON file describing your plums in perpetuity, or for as long as fruitnfts.com stays in business. The plums themselves, I burned them. Forgive me, they made a lot of smoke." And here you can see a screenshot of how the tweet of the poem is presented on a website that offers it for sale as a non-fungible token. Now, since the tweet still awaits its buyers, it hasn't been minted onto the blockchain itself, but when it eventually will be bought, it's gonna look something more or less like this. It will be, so within the token that someone will buy, there's gonna be a link to a vSend server that hosts a metadata object containing the information about the author of the poem, some short description of it, a pointer to a preview of sorts, and the pointer to the artifact itself. And this is the format that many of tokenized artworks rely on now. And it is this type of bundle of multi-layered metadata that constitutes the object of ownership, as the notion is being now framed by the NFT proponents. So it is an information about the collection of information about a born digital artifact, rather than the artifact itself, uniquely identifiable within the structure of a universally recognized and thus quasi-objective database. So, this is nothing new really, and using the same description, we would be able to explain previous protocols designed by artists and art professionals for collectorship of digital art. And most adequate here being perhaps the art website sales contract by Raphael Rosendahl. Because here too, the scarcity that market value of the work is hinged on comes from the uniqueness of the index pointing to the website, the domain name, within a universally recognized database, the domain name system. But while there's the basic mechanism is shared between those two models, there's many differences between them. And most important one that I'd like to speak about here now is that unlike the NFT sphere, Raphael's contract recognizes the practice of private and institutional collection as more than transfer of resale rights, of course. Instead, it is a transfer of both rights and obligations, the duty to ensure the accessibility of the work to its online audience over time, taking care of hosting periodically, renewing the domain name, and becoming part of discussion addressing challenges of the work's preservation. And this idea of collector as a seeder, to use a BitTorrent lingo that I will also rely on later on, is something that the NFT experiments have an opportunity to advance. But as it stands now, this opportunity is not only missed, but the idea itself, the idea of a collector as a seeder, is diffused by the common misunderstanding of the permanence and immutability of blockchain, and is replaced by the incentive to flip the works frequently and maximize collectors' return on investments. Those considerations of longevity and perishability and preservation are almost completely absent from the practices of the NFT market as they are forming now. Now, of course, we came to expect propositions that are coming from this blockchain space to be always veiled in salvationist rhetoric and announced in grandiose statements of emancipation from platform monopolies and so on. But what happens instead now is that while the promise to disrupt the hierarchies of control, cultural production online is entangled in falls flat, while those promises fall flat, its collateral casualty is the sense of responsibility whose abandonment can be observed on more than one level. The one that received most scrutiny so far is the environmental level, of course, but I believe that this is another way in which it manifests itself. So now let's go back to what is being collected as a token when someone collects a token. So this is the actual information that is stored in a token that's associated with one of the Beeple works sold through Nifty. It is a link to where the file, it is a link to a metadata file that in turn links to where the file is actually stored. So here is the JSON file that contains a description, a couple of more additional information, and then the URL to the file itself, which is hosted by Cloudify and served by Nifty, meaning that when Nifty shuts down, the link points to nothing. And here we have a second variant, which is again, the information stored in the token being some sort of pointer to the metadata containing another pointer to the work itself. Now, as you can see here, those URLs look a bit different and they point to an IPFS gateway. And IPFS stands for Interplanetary File System, which is a very interesting protocol reorganizing the way, a little bit, the way files circulate through a network, combining principles from distributed ledger technology, BitTorrent, and Git. And IPFS is a lot of things, but and I will talk about them in a second. But one thing that it is not is some sort of magical permanent data storage. Rather, the accessibility of the file here is dependent on the number of nodes in the network that host it. And similarly, as with BitTorrent, when the file is abandoned by seeders and peers in the network, it is no longer retrievable. And this is, of course, something that's already happening to works sold as NFTs. So Check My NFT is one of the websites that tries to bring to the foreground the perishability of the born digital media underlying the tokens, representing them in the NFT market. They run a daily audit of the files referenced in the token and publish the results, with many of the requests returning an error. And those works that were minted on the chain, those works that return an error were minted on the chain not years ago or even months ago, but days ago. And they somehow managed to vanish. And I think that based on this, we can project into the future a pretty interesting image where a couple of years from now, it might be that we will see a section of the blockchain that's a permanent and immutable record of 404 messages or references to 404 messages, something like the immortal memory, like in a permanent state of dementia, which is maybe a bit too dramatic way of putting it. But the questions here are, is first, would people invested in this space actually care or even notice if this happens? Because after all, the trade of these signs can proceed as usual, whether they have any referent or not. And this question I will leave open. And the second one is, are there any ways in which this flaw can be addressed, or are there any techniques used by the sphere that can be helpful in addressing the problem that, of course, isn't specific to it, because link rot isn't anything new, naturally. And here I would like to talk a little bit more about the, here's the chain of 404 links. And here I would like to talk a little bit more about the IPFS that I mentioned earlier, the Interplanetary File System, and how it combines principles of BitTorrent, blockchain, and Git. So it's a protocol that allows for the network to be searched not by where the requested files are supposed to be, but rather by what they are. Content-based addressing being the technical term for this. So a file uploaded to the network is associated with a digital footprint or a hash, an alphanumeric string of a fixed length that corresponds to a structure of a data object. The hash is the basis of how a file corresponding to it is circulated in the network, retrieved upon a user request, not from any specific server, but from all the peers that host it, similarly to BitTorrent. This is so far very similar. And as in BitTorrent now, to request the file simultaneously become its provider, caching chunks of it. However, unless that content is explicitly said to be saved or pinned in the lingo of IPFS, unless it is explicitly said to be saved by the node, after a while it is removed by a cyclical memory purge called garbage collection. And the mapping of files and nodes is stored in a distributed hash table, a point of overlap between IPFS and blockchains and their distributed ledgers. Now, this setup already allows for an arrangement of collective ownership where online resilience of the work depends on a network of custodians rather than any single point bearing the responsibility for its upkeep. But what remains problematic in it is the relationship between hash or a unique content identifier and the idea of originality as it is pushed by the champions of the tokenized works. So a use of a digital footprint of a file as a parameter of its authenticity and purity that allows for differentiation between legitimate and illegitimate copies. The problem with this fetishization of a hash as identity of a digital artwork is that it runs counter to the affordances of variability and dynamism that's so valuable about this medium. But at the same time, the use of hash as a reference point through which to thread lines of relation and continuities between different modalities of the work, its version and documentation seems like a very good basis on which the meaning of a work, the meanings of the work can retain the relational character as they unfold. And this is a bit of a speculation on my part, but it seems that versioning system IPFS borrows from Git provides a technique or technical context in which to pursue such a project, allowing for individual contributions made by institutions, collectors, and researchers to interweave with each other. I think that borrowing the metaphor that was brought up yesterday or day before yesterday, I think, of a work of art as a core and documentation as shells that form around it, complementing each other and that together constitute a whole. I think that tools like that might be a good adhesive that make all of it stick. But at the same time, however, obviously the work does not only belong to the level of technical protocols, as made evident by the fact that the tools are already there. It's just their use is directed by different interests right now. Crypto art, NFT, blockchain, and so forth, as a vehicle might have been hijacked by runaway speculation, but I think that, and that's also what I wanted to highlight with my presentation, that under the hood of this vehicle, there might be parts that can be useful for the type of work that this conference and people gathered here and institutions that they work with are dedicated to. So to tie all of this into this larger context of the NFT craze and controversy and discussion, as the NFT market will necessarily descend down the slope of the hype cycle, there might be an opportunity to recalibrate how this economy is organized and what type of ethics, if any, it respects. And it might be possible to find points of injection and exert a level of agency over the standards and practices it adopts. But it also might be that in a couple of months or years, the bubble will just burst and the whole thing will just crash in the trial of disillusionment. But I think that even then, it might be possible to look at this wreckage and find some useful parts in it that it can be stripped for and with which something else and something more useful can be built. So that's something I wanted to point your attention to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. This is really interesting to go through the nitty-gritty of blockchain and what it means when it comes to documentation. And I think whereas with someone like Benjamin, you can kind of imagine, how it's a bit abstract, but you can kind of imagine how reproduction relates to aura. I think one of the challenges of this kind of new NFT-based technology and these new protocols is that it's more difficult to imagine the properties of these kind of linked, self-referential, and nested forms of documentation. Very tiny question because we're running short on time here. I was curious if I understood you correctly regarding Spotifyication. Is that a verb that you used?
Spotification.
Specifically to this, I was because you seem to be implying that IPFS protocol would be interesting to experiment with when it comes to the documentation needs we have. And of course, you probably know I'm going to ask then, this artwork that was sold, the people artwork for the expensive, whatever, any comments on that, of the potential of it actually being an economy attached to the type of work we're doing in documentation?
Well, I think that first of all, the entire system is sort of based on references and pointing from one place to another, and then pointing from one representation to another representation. So I think that the inherent potential of all of it is kind of already favoring this type of buildup of different facets of a work, rather than reducing it to any original state. Sort of any original that can then be assigned a scarcity to it. I think that I to be honest, the things gets very complicated the moment all of those parties come together, when we have the auction houses with their sort of legacy models and the crypto zone, and then all of this new crypto money that enters into the conversation. I think that this gets very, very, very difficult. But I think like what I was trying to elucidate in those 15 minutes that I was speaking is one particular thread that might be worth pulling at, as this whole thing will in the upcoming time start to clarify, and things will start to break, and we will see exactly what will remain after the bubble bursts.
All right, interesting times, never dull moments. All right, thank you very much. We're moving now to chapter 2, which is the last cluster of speakers for this symposium, and I'm very happy to introduce our last 2 speakers. So we have Annie Abrams, who's based in Montpellier, and her practice is really, as it's said in the bio, meandering between research and performance. And I think it's very interesting to bring this legacy of performance art into the discussions on documentation, because there are many shared questions when it comes to media art in general, and especially generative, live, distributed, interactive pieces, that we can learn a lot from this history of performance art. And joining her is Helen Varley-Jamieson, who is a writer, theatre practitioner, and digital artist from New Zealand. Their full bios are on the website, but for the sake of time, I will pass the baton directly to them.
Hi. Are you going to start, Annie?
Annie, go ahead.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. I'm still muted. It's no problem. I think we start immediately with showing you a video, the video where we were invited for. And we don't have to say anything. You can just watch it. And now I have to find... Yes, it's okay. And I have to share the audio. I have to go back again. Let me see if that is possible. Do you hear me? Do you hear the video?
Yes, we do. I hear it.
Le rire en tant que langage, utilisant Zoom. Untitled Dragon, dans Second Life et Mainland.
Distant Movements, dispositif de visioconférence, Zoom.
Entanglement training, using Adobe Connect.
Oui, nusus, tutte spastardi elettronici che usando lingue globali
In the reading plan, an adaptation of Etherpad.
Cortejo praiano, cortege on the beach, performance divulgada na plataforma Waterwheel.
Degardisi, اجرای در برنامه Waterwheel. Metamorphosing, performance on Waterwheel.
All the better to see you with, using Upstage.
Ojo de agua, Waterhole, usando el tab de Waterwheel.
Letters and bridges, cartas y puentes, using SoundJack.
Identity project, using video conferencing.
So far away, yet so near. The technology that was used was the Waterwheel platform as well as Skype.
Siberian Child Circle, using Upstage.
Angry Women, Take 2 with Mosaica TV interface.
Umbrales, artes vivas en casa. Performance teledistribuida en Internet.
Double bind, bras de tête et tête de fer, using a custom-made interface made by panoply.org.
It was titled Lucha Libre, and it was on a platform called Blog TV.
Baba Yaga, created with shadow puppetry and object theatre techniques using Upstage.
Learn to hear through the lights of your eyes. The cyberforming hybridization of Tuxedomon in Upstage.
Dropping of the Edge of the World. The platform is the early version of Second Life.
Dissension Convention.
Visitor Studio using Flash technology.
Sonic Circus mix audiovisual files in the file mixing platform Visitor Studio.
An improvisation based on Thanatonauts on the Access Grid.
Here I come again, Flying Birdman. We used QuickTime Streaming Server and QuickTime Broadcaster software.
Howl Elite Force Voyager Online using Star Trek Elite Force Voyager Online technology.
Liquid Gold, and it used QuickTime streaming and Shockwave clients and a Shockwave server.
Paycheck, Performance Poet, Firebird's Palace.
Wirefire, a handmade mix of Flash and CGI scripts.
Un thé extravagant avec le matériel audiovisuel du studio de télévision et de l'Internet ADSL.
8 dialogues using IRC Internet Relay Chat.
An interactive telerobotic sculpture performance using Netscape server push animation with the CGI script.
The Greenest Fools, #1 in the Christmas series by the Plaintext Players. It took place on PMC Moo.
El Noctazteca, using Mbon, Ruben Martinez offered a performative rant from Electronic Cafe.
Telematic Dreaming, an ISDN video conferencing installation between two beds in separate locations.
All right.
So
the question you asked seems to be suggestive somehow of that some people would only have their first online performance in 2020. With this pandemic all of a sudden being screen bound. Asking the question to the two of you, when was your first online performance?
maybe we can show it because it is somehow prepared in this.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I hope it's working. This is once again all the names of the people and the works that were in the video. And this is us. These are our first performances. I did mine in IRC. That was in a performance with a Norwegian art school, where I asked the question, who is Annie Abrahams, when I was still anonymous online. And there were 4 people playing all Annie. And the most extraordinary thing about it was that one of them was me. People couldn't guess which one I was at the time, but 2 weeks after, I myself didn't know it either anymore. So that time was a time of playing and thinking about who you are online and what is your personality there. Then Helen.
Yeah, my first online performance, well, at least the first one that I can really find evidence of was in 2000 in the Palace, which was a graphical sonic chat room, very early technology that allowed you to have graphical avatars speaking with text-to-speech voices. And I was working with a group called Desktop Theatre, who had started using this environment about 5 years before to create live performances that were a kind of online street theatre, really. So that was, I discovered them in '99, and then this is the first one I could find actually written down that we'd done. And this was when we were asking people what their first performance was. This was often the case that people didn't have any documentation from their first online performances because, yeah, I mean, the whole thing of documentation of live performance is a whole other question. It's difficult to document a live experience in a way that is really representing it. The documentation is always something else. So for a lot of these early performances, there are only a few screen grabs or other odd traces that remain. And then Suzanne Fuchs is the third person that made this video together with Annie and I, and her first performance there online was in 2003, which was also mentioned in the video by James Cunningham.
Yes.
Should we say, Annie, about the motivation for making the video, because that is kind of responding to that question?
Yes, go, Ellen, please.
Okay. Well, look, obviously last year, many live performance and theatre maker people had to turn to the internet because of the pandemic closing theatres all over the world. And for the first time, these people were trying to find a way to use the internet to disseminate their work, to present their work, to reach their audiences, to create and to maintain their work in some kind of way. And there was a lot of stories in the media about people inventing new ways of doing theatre and for the first time doing this, that, and the next thing. And I was concerned that this was, of course, really interesting work and a lot of exciting stuff happening, but it was invisibilizing this massive history that goes right back to the beginning of the internet. So the idea of the video was to do a sort of backwards countdown to see how far back we could get and just show that people were doing this and experimenting with these things a long time before the pandemic forced the majority of people to look to the internet as a site for live performance. So that was the initial motivation, was to respond to this idea of online performance having been something that was invented last year.
Yeah, and while doing it, our concern was to find as much different platforms as possible that we could remember, and to take care that we would have people from different countries and different practices. And so afterwards, when the video was published, we got a lot of reactions of people who said, yes, my first was earlier, or I did this, I did that. It's just a tiny, tiny bit of what was happening before 2020 online.
we really wanted to provoke people to think about it, because a lot of people, when they start to think about it, they realize they had heard of something or seen something or in some way been part of something online a long time ago. So it really has opened up a lot of discussion about what was going on in the past, which is what we wanted to do.
Yes. And shall we go to the symposium? Yes.
Let's go to the symposium.
Because that was not the first time we were preoccupied with the history of network performance or cyberperformance. Already in 2012, I forgot what was the exact reason. Maybe there wasn't anything else but us wanting to know about our own history. And we made a small group of people that are mentioned here. And with these people, we started thinking about how can we get attention for the whole history? How can we get to know more about it ourselves? And we made a call. Do I remember that well, Helen?
Yes. Yes. And just to say that for the symposium, the person who had the first idea was Francesco Buonaiuto, who suggested that we make a kind of conference about cyberperformance, and then we all got in behind it.
Yes, because he wrote a master thesis or something.
Yeah, he'd written a PhD on it.
Theater.
Unfortunately in Italian, so I've never been able to read it.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And
yes, yeah.
Yes. And then the symposium was a one-day online event on the 12th of October 2012, and it went for over a period of about 12 hours. We had, I think there was 4 blocks of presentations of about 3 hours each, with gaps in between, and there was over 100 people would have connected over the whole time, and I think there was normally sort of between about 50 and 70 people there, and most of it took place in a platform called Waterwheel Tap, which allowed people to chat alongside the presentations. And following the symposium, Annie and I edited a book, in which we gathered a whole lot of texts and documentation material from the symposium. So we have the recordings of all of the talks on the website, which is just symposium.net. But in the book, we included a variety of things. Sometimes we've included the actual presentation text. Other times we've got reviews, or we've done a combination of the chat discussion that was coming alongside the conversation, the presentations, which was also really interesting and rich discussion happening all the time in the chat, with people questioning and commenting, posting links, bringing up other things alongside people's presentations.
Yeah,
so the book is actually another work in itself.
Yeah, but what we did is we also organized.
I'm sorry to very, very briefly interrupt, just with a small housekeeping announcement. For those who have booked a workshop, those who have tickets have a workshop with SF MoMA, it's starting now. Everyone else can stay here. We're continuing the conversation, but I just want to remind for those who have a Passepartout ticket that the workshop will be starting now at 6. Sorry to interrupt. You may continue. Yeah.
Okay.
What was very interesting at the time was the big audience participation and in this symposium. And what we did, Helen and I, is also reorganizing all the chat texts and make small chapters of it, which have titles like Space and Time, Extimacy, Net Intimacy, Distanmacy, a new type of audience. We are still trying to figure out what to say one to another. It was already outdated when we started. That were the kind of chapter. And today I looked a little bit back in it, and most of it is still really very actual. There is, it's not dated at all.
Mm.
because we are still finding out how to do that online.
And it's been quite interesting reading some of the things that are coming out now with people who are going online with live performance for the first time, and thinking, oh yeah, we were discussing this 20 years ago, and things have moved on, and there are different technologies now. There are a lot of differences about now and then, but the issues remain very much the same. I'm trying to think of an example, but at the moment I just can't think of one right now. But people are grappling with a lot of the same questions that we were exploring here in the symposium, and have been exploring, different artists since artists first got access to the internet. This is the link there for the video on Vimeo, if people want to have a look at it.
I think it is clear we didn't make this to make history, but to show that there was more than what people thought, and to maybe honor a little bit of what people did in mostly small niches, to honor the fertile ground where things that are happening now are built on. It was like that.
Yeah, we have framed the video by saying we asked some of our peers when was their first online performance, and that this is just a glimpse or a snapshot. We're not trying to be comprehensive in any way, and also when is the key thing, rather than what or who. We were interested in looking back at the timeline that disappears off into the lost ether of the early internet.
Thank you so much. This is really interesting to see the richness of the practices that predate the current crisis moment we're in, and I think it's really important to learn from these. And I'm interested if perhaps you can give a couple of examples of things we can learn for now about not reinventing the wheel when it comes for types of interaction, documentation, these kind of setups. Because I think right now, when you ask the question for the first time again, you can miss some of the richness or the details of this. So, are there any particular examples you'd like to share, especially looking at documentation of experiments that have been done so far?
I can say something of that. I think documentation is not just a video recording. Documentation should be an edited video at least. It means that there should be a beginning and an end. It should have a context of where it happened and what happened at a certain time. Most of the time now you see just, oh yes, it happened online, here, go, the video.
It's very much like theatre. When you see a video of a theatre performance, it's very flat. It misses the liveness. We're making theatre, we're making live performance. We're not making film or video. If we wanted to make film or video, we would do that, and we would do it differently. So what is really important is that live interaction. And some of the things that I've learned are like the things that people see as problems, like lag or breaks in the connection or technical mistakes and things, are actually really they're features of the landscape, and they can add a really important part of liveness to the performance. And they really get your audience on side with you. I mean, it's like when someone forgets their lines in a theatre performance, you can feel the audience wanting them to get through that difficult moment. And I think that is also the same in cyberperformance or live online performance. When you watch a video or a film, you expect it to be perfect. Somebody has slaved for hours over every minute of that video to make it really how they want it to be. But in live performance, there is always risk. Every live performance is different, and that is what makes it so beautiful. So that is one thing about embracing the technical problems and not seeing them as problems. And another thing I think is the audience, you know, the fact of the audience being there. I do a lot of work where the audience are really active in the chat, in the text chat. And I think this should never be underestimated. A lot of people think, oh, text chat, it's nothing really so important. But we have people writing poetry in the text chat. We have people doing ASCII art in the text chat. We have people sharing links. Sometimes people recognize each other in the chat and start having a conversation about something totally other. It's a fascinating area, and I think it brings really a lot to the live performance.
Yeah, these are two really interesting aspects you bring in here. The glitches, let's say, and the risk of liveness, and the possibilities of text documentation by audience members or by participants. Concerning the first one, when it comes to glitches and liveness, of course, this is exactly what's lost through documentation.
Yeah.
Right? How do you deal with that, or what are examples of how? Because it's you know, you might have loss of aura when it comes to objects being reproduced, but the loss of the liveness, especially in this type of work, it's a big deal in documentation, right?
It is really complicated for me because, and in fact, you cannot really document what is happening. You can only make translations of it. So, and one kind of translation is selecting in the chat. Another kind of translation that can together is editing the video you've recorded. But it will never be the same. It's impossible.
And it depends why you're making the documentation as well. I mean, often we're making documentation for funding purposes, you know, either to meet the requirements of a grant or to have some material for a future grant. And then the documentation becomes less about the work and more about trying to produce something that kind of looks good or might appeal to somebody, or for promotional purposes. And it's difficult. I use just text chat logs as ways to go back and remember what has happened.
That opens up the possibility then of, let's say, faking documentation of something that never happened. Do you ever find yourself tempted to do that?
Yeah, I think it does happen. I mean, there are things where something has really gone wrong, and you sort of patch together a few things to put on the website, where it can look like the thing was really perfect and great, when it was a bit of a disaster. Yeah, so I mean, I think everybody does that, not only in live perform. No, I mean, people across other disciplines, of course, if you're putting things on the website, you choose the bit that you like the most or you feel satisfied with, so in a way, all documentation is a kind of a fake.
But you cannot fake it. If it doesn't exist, you're not going to make it afterwards.
No, although, I mean, I have done some things where I have re-recorded something, like done another sort of performance with no audience in order to get the bit that wasn't recorded or that had a big problem in it or something like this.
Well, this is a part of facsimile debate, I guess, right? Like when you say all documentation is kind of fake, I find this an interesting statement.
Yeah.
It's not true for me. It's not true at all. All documentation is real again.
But it's real documentation. But it's like what you said before, Annie, the documentation is not the performance.
Yeah, indeed.
So if other people are looking at that documentation to think that they're seeing the performance, they're not seeing the performance because it's not the live event. So in that respect, it's a kind of a fake.
It's only a fake if you are doing it with a certain purpose, to convince someone from something. It's not fake if you make your own documentation. If you think, I want to translate what was happening at that moment over there, then you make a new artwork in a certain
Yeah.
way. That's not,
but I think
for me, I never make fake things. I only
no,
make.
but I think if I understood Helen correctly, please to correct me if I'm wrong. What I heard you saying though is you seem to be sort of playing with the notion of fake, right? So it's fake in the sense that it's in the way that a fake cheese can still serve as a prop in a film, right? It serves a purpose. Documentation it loses the liveness. It's real documentation, but it's not the real event because you lose something in it.
Yeah, this is what I mean. It's
Yeah,
not the real event, and it's even. I think we're actually saying the same thing, Annie, because you're saying it's a translation, and it is like when I look at the book of the symposium, for example, this is another complete work, and it presents. We've taken the material of the symposium and we've made a new work out of it that is more than and also less than the live event. It's something else. And I think any documentation of theatre or live performance is that. And it's also, if you think about documenting theatre, you can document things like the program and the poster and the newspaper advertisements and these things that are not actually part of the performance as well. So you have all of these objects of documentation. And then if you have the recording of the performance and people look at that recording and think they are seeing the performance, that is where this kind of unreality comes in, because they are not seeing the performance. They're seeing documentation of the performance. And I think in theatre and in online performance, there is a big tendency for people to take hold of these recordings, and they have a bigger life and a longevity that the performance itself doesn't have. And there's a danger that the work disappears under the documentation. And I don't know how we solve that. I really don't. But I think including things like the text chats and these other things and seeing it as a translation, as a reworking and a new piece of art is part of
and, sorry, if I may ask Annie also if you respond to this a little bit and elaborate on this idea that there's a danger that the work disappears under its documentation. I think this is an interesting statement you make here.
Yeah, but Helen is not me and I'm not Helen. I'm not afraid of that at all.
Okay, so, go ahead then. That's why I'm curious.
No, because I have a different background. Helen is from theater. I'm from contemporary art. And performance means different things in these two domains. So in contemporary art is everything you produce has a context and you think about it all the time. So documentation in contemporary art is a photo of something, but maybe it's also my way of doing things. I'm never going to put a video of a performance online if I don't think it is worth something in itself as a video and not as a performance anymore. And I do recognize that the moment of the performance, and that is what we have in common, Helen and I, is the most, it's not even the most important moment, but it is the very special moment that you have to be there at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some, and as long as we talk about the chat, if it's the chat space during a performance, if you don't have that chat space somehow mediated, it is often not going to work. So it's often then only bar talk, but bar talk can be interesting too as documentation. But then if you just publish it like that as bar talk, I don't think it's interesting. Then you have to translate that again. Either you make a poem out of it or
there's a curatorial aspect. There's a curatorial aspect, I think, to documentation in this sense.
Yeah.
And I found it really interesting what you said in the process of making this book, which, and also this video, in which you as as artists, as theater makers, as performers, as researchers, have also positioned yourself as curators of this kind of anthology of practices, which becomes a new work. I was thinking about how an anthology kind of means like a gathering of of flowers or sheaves. So it's like a multiplicity of practices become, you gathered them, you asked the question, which kind of got all of these different practices to come out of the woodwork, in a sense. They're quite different from each other, but they have in common that they were before 2020 and many different kinds. But you find an organizing principle that collects them. So how would you position yourself, let's say, as curators also of documentation that includes other people's practices as well in this work? How do you see that? Does it make sense what I'm saying so far?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to answer it, Annie?
No, go. Yeah, the only thing I think is I didn't feel myself a curator when we were doing that.
The video or the symposium?
The video. Because we were talking about the video. Yeah. I didn't feel that I was curating anything. I had certain rules, and the rules were it should be on the internet and not using only, for instance, satellite technology. It was an internet project.
And a live performance.
Yeah, live performance, and the place where audience and makers meet. That was important for us. And then the curation comes from who do you know and who don't you know, and what person do you think of at that moment. And then you think, yes, but we never have something of Second Life. Let's ask that person because we know that person did something in that domain. And it would be good if we showed to all those people that it was very diverse, that it's not just to one or two people doing things online.
Yeah, but that's the sort of work, for example, that I couldn't make. I wouldn't know those people. I wouldn't know who to ask. Building on the whole archive of your experience.
Yeah, it's our networks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think me and Annie and Suzanne, we have quite a lot of overlapping networks, but we also have different networks because of our locations and our different interests that have led us into different areas. But it is by no means comprehensive. And although we did consciously try to include a variety of platforms and locations and languages and things, we didn't lose sleep over trying to be completely inclusive of everything, because this was not within our possibility. And we also did it in a pretty short space of time. I think.
How long did it take you?
I'm just trying to remember when we actually first started, but it was really only over 2.5 or 3 months.
Yes, something like that.
We wrote to people.
We talked about it for the first time in October, something like that.
And we published it on the 1st of February. So that was really just, let's say 3 months, which is, there was a kind of urgency to get it done, because we were saying we were talking about in 2020, people were doing this for the first time. So there was a thought that we might get it done in 2020, but we didn't, obviously. But, we didn't want to spend a lot of time trying to find things, and we didn't have any funding for it. We were just making it ourselves in our spare time. So, and Suzanne she's the one with the video editing skills. So she was doing all of the work of putting it together. So it was quite quick and intended to be sort of a quick look around at our own networks and just pulling out some to put in.
As artists. That's very clear, not academics or not researchers. And we secretly hope someone is picking up to make the whole history.
Or at least to make other ones that show other parts.
All right, so this is a shout out to those who are watching or listening in. So you say, would you invite people to make new versions and to add? And
Absolutely, they can take the idea and do their own version of it. and show us some of the ones that we don't know about, because you know we're white Western people, mainly based in Europe and Australia and New Zealand, so our networks are naturally in these areas. But there's whole other, well, we did have quite a few people out of South America actually, but I'm sure that there have been people in other parts of the world speaking other languages that we just haven't encountered what they've been doing. And it would be great if people made other versions of the similar kind of concept.
So an invitation to fork, let's say.
Yeah, yeah.
Last question I'd like to, or last issue I'd like to address with you before rounding off for tonight, is regarding these networks and platforms and care structures. You already hinted that you did this without funding as such.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually quite a labor of love to bring together all these practices to answer this question you asked. What type of infrastructure do you think is needed in the field for in your expertise to support the continuation of these performative distributed practices and to support the documentation thereof? What's already there, and in what way could we say do better as a support system?
For the practice.
Well, I was just thinking about how with all the funding that's come out around the pandemic, people have said to me, "Oh, isn't it great? There's now all this funding for your kind of work." And I'm saying, yeah, but there's now 100 times more people trying to get the same amount of funding. So obviously there are issues around funding, and I think there's never enough, and there's always a lot of competition for it. But one thing that I've always struggled with the funding is working globally and without a specific base anywhere is very difficult to get funding. And I've just been looking at some German funds. I live in Germany. And they have things like, yes, it's for digital performances, and you must have a premiere and 5 performances in Germany. And it's like, well, it's online. So does that count for Germany? And I think funding organizations still
the address. Yeah.
They need to catch up with this, that people are now working without necessarily being based anywhere. So that's one thing. And it does, of course, raise a whole lot of issues around payment and tax and all of these kind of things that come with funding.
Yeah.
I'm
sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, in my case, I think it's quite clear, because I had the same reactions. Oh, Annie, now it's your time. And then I thought, yes, it's my time. They asked me to do free courses and talks, not paid for, and etc., etc. But any clear production money is not there, and that's not only because that isn't there, but it is because I stay working in a niche. I'm working in a domain that is in between research and art. It's artistic research, and if you're not academic, then that is difficult to get funded. And but it's a choice. It has always been like that.
Right. And let's say in this let's say thought experiment that there would be funding available. Let's say there's pot of money here, virtual pot of money. What parts of that money would you put towards documentation, and in what ways? What would you want to happen? It's a hard question.
It's a hard question. I mean, one thing that it's just making me think about is that at the moment we're rebuilding Upstage, which is the platform that I've been involved with for the last 18 years. And one of the things that we're hoping we're going to be able to build in it is a kind of a replay feature, whereby, because the way that it works is messages are sent between the browser and the server about what is happening on the stage. And apart from live audio visual streams, everything is involving messages and assets that are on the server. So if you're not using live audio visual streams, the idea is that you could sort of press a replay button, and the series of actions that have been done in the live performance would be replayed in the same way that they were in the live performance. But then once you introduce live streams into it, then you have to have those streams saved and kept somewhere, and having that kind of video really quickly becomes a storage issue. So there's issues of where you're storing them, as well as also the costs of streaming. Like it becomes very expensive very quickly when you are talking about hosting something yourself that is sending out streams to a lot of people. So that's kind of a tangent thing there, but just thinking about what right now I'm having to think about how we use the money that we have and what things are the priority.
Right, thank you very much. Any last thoughts before we close for the session?
Yes, I think I would like something completely different. And Helen, I think a lot of things like reactions from people, I ask them often and they send them to me. I also analyze performances over time, because nothing is very unique in the sense that it's always evolving. What I would like for documentation is more someone from the outside looking at it and writing on it. And
yeah, I'd like that too. I do find having to always document your own work is quite exhausting.
I like it. It's part of what I do, but I would like to have a kind of expert outside views written along what we are doing.
That would be great.
So what I share a double invitation extended. One was to take this this wonderful collection you've made of online performative practices and to expand it. And two is to come and collaborate with you in terms of documentation, so that you won't have to do it all yourself. These are the two things. And I think that actually fits perfectly in the theme for next year's symposium, which I've been asked to announce already, which will be about distributed collaborative platforms for knowledge exchange. So these are different ways of, let's say, sharing knowledge, sharing roles within one project to expand beyond disciplines or beyond expertise in different ways. So for today, I would say thank you for everyone who contributed your knowledge and expertise to this session, and for those who contributed to the Etherpad, for the technicians behind the scenes, for Gaby for the invitation, and for all of the different people who have been involved in asking questions along the way. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity.
Yes.
Thank you.
Really been a pleasure talking with you. I've learned so much.
Great, it's been fun.